I heard from Olivia Fields yesterday, Brett remarked. She's being promoted to chief of staff at Meridian. Thomas Wheeler specifically mentioned her integrity during the Jeffrey Lowe investigation as a key factor in the decision. Welcome back. We're so grateful for each one of you. We'd love to know, what part of the world are you watching from right now? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's dive into today's story. The crystal glasses chimed softly as servers navigated through the crowd at the Meridian Technologies holiday party. The grand ballroom at the Four Seasons Seattle shimmered with thousands of tiny lights reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting an almost ethereal glow against the backdrop of the city skyline. Brett stood near the bar, his fingers loosely holding a tumbler of scotch he barely sipped. His security training had taught him to remain alert even in social settings, and tonight was no exception. He observed his wife, Sherry, commanding the center of the room, her burgundy dress catching the light as she laughed at something a senior partner had said. "She's quite something, isn't she?" The voice beside him belonged to Jeffrey Lowe, the newly appointed CFO of Meridian. Brett turned to find the man standing a little too close, his scent, a mix of expensive cologne and single malt whiskey, lingering in the air. 12 years and counting, Brett replied, his tone neutral despite the unease creeping up his spine. He'd spent 15 years studying people's body language, and something about Jeffrey's posture set off warning bells. Jeffrey's hand landed briefly on Brett's shoulder, pressing just hard enough to feel deliberate. "Your department's performance has been exceptional this quarter. The board is very pleased with the new security protocols you've implemented," Jeffrey said. "Just doing my job," Brett replied, shrugging modestly, but his eyes never strayed far from Jeffrey, noting how the man's gaze continually drifted to where Sherry stood. There was something in that look, something more than professional appreciation, something that lingered, hungry. "We should discuss expanding your team's budget over lunch sometime," Jeffrey continued, finally withdrawing his hand from Brett's shoulder. "The tech landscape is evolving rapidly, and we need to stay ahead of potential threats." Brett nodded, catching another quick glance from Jeffrey toward Sherry. "That would be great. Have your assistant reach out to mine for scheduling," Brett said, maintaining his composure. Across the room, Sherry was now deep in conversation with Dana Sanders, Jeffrey's wife. Dana's forced smile was all too familiar to Brett. She nodded along, listening to Sherry, but her eyes betrayed her. Polite, but with a hint of discomfort. Brett had seen that look before. "Brett!" Sherry's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd as she waved him over. "Come here, darling. Dana and I were just discussing the charity gala next month." As Brett made his way across the room, snippets of conversations floated to him. Martin from accounting was griping about his mother-in-law's extended stay. Sarah from HR was showing off photos of her new beach house in Maui. The usual office party banter that felt oddly hollow tonight. "There you are," Sherry said, slipping her arm through his with practiced ease. Her Chanel No. 5 perfume, the same scent she wore on their first date, wafted around them. "Dana was just telling me about this amazing resort in Bali. We should consider it for our anniversary trip." Brett watched as Jeffrey appeared behind his wife, his hand landing on Dana's lower back in a gesture that was too possessive to be casual. Dana's shoulder twitched slightly at the contact, but her smile remained frozen. "The private villas are extraordinary," Dana said, her voice carrying that perfect, practiced tone of Seattle's elite. "Complete privacy, your own infinity pool, butler service. Sounds perfect for a romantic getaway," Jeffrey added, his eyes meeting Sherry's for just a beat too long. Brett noticed Sherry's fingers tighten slightly on his arm. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a tender gesture, but to Brett, it was a warning signal. It was the same tension he saw when Sherry was preparing for a high-stakes negotiation. "We'll have to compare schedules," Brett said smoothly, unwilling to engage in the tension. "The first quarter is always busy with security audits." Sherry laughed, a sound that was as delicate as crystal wind chimes. "Oh, you and your audits. Sometimes I think you're married to your job more than me." Her comment drew a few polite chuckles from the group, but Brett caught the sharp edge in her voice. It was the same tone she used in the courtroom when laying the foundation for a crucial point. "Speaking of jobs," Jeffrey said, the words casual but laced with intention. "Sherry, I heard Caldwell and Ross landed the Maxitech merger." Quite a coup. Brett watched as Sherry's professional mask slipped into place seamlessly. We don't discuss ongoing cases, Jeffrey. You know that. But there was a playful lilt to her reprimand, one that made Brett's instincts prickle. The conversation eventually shifted to safer topics. The unusually warm weather, the new restaurant opening downtown, the latest exhibit at the Seattle Art Museum. But Brett remained vigilant, cataloging every subtle interaction, every lingering glance, every small shift in body language. Later that night, as they drove home in their Tesla Model S, Sherry scrolled through her phone, occasionally humming with satisfaction at what Brett assumed were likes on her latest Instagram post. A perfectly staged photo of them from the party, #blessed. Jeffrey seems to be settling into his role well, she remarked casually, not looking up from her screen. Brett kept his gaze on the rain-slicked road, his mind alert. He does. Dana mentioned they're having some issues with their new house renovation. Apparently, the contractor found major structural problems. Sherry's fingers moved rapidly across her phone's keyboard. She seemed pretty stressed about it. Brett murmured, quietly storing away the information along with everything else he'd observed that evening. Their home in the Laurel Hiss neighborhood was bathed in darkness when they pulled into the circular driveway. The security lights flickered on automatically, illuminating the manicured lawns and carefully arranged flower beds. Everything was in its place, perfectly maintained, just like their public image. As they prepared for bed, Brett watched Sherry through the bathroom mirror, observing her nightly routine. Removing makeup, applying expensive creams, checking her work email one last time. She was beautiful, ambitious, and entirely in her element in their meticulously curated life. "Good party," she said, finally settling into bed beside him. Although the catering hadn't been as good as last year, Brett gave a non-committal sound, his mind already processing the evening's observations, filing away details that, to others, might seem insignificant but for him, set off alarm bells. "Good night, darling," Sherry murmured, turning off the bedside lamp. In the darkness, Brett lay awake, his thoughts swirling around Jeffrey's lingering glances, Dana's strained smile, and the subtle shifts in Sherry's behavior that most people would overlook. After 15 years in corporate security, Brett knew that the most dangerous threats often disguised themselves as harmless interactions, and the most dangerous predators were the friendliest masks. The perfect life they'd built, the house, the careers, the social media presence, suddenly felt like a carefully constructed stage set. Brett couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere behind the scenes, someone was preparing to change the script. The March rain drummed steadily against the windows of Brett's office on the 14th floor of Meridian Technologies headquarters. But Brett's focus wasn't on the view. His attention was fixed on the security footage playing on his monitor, showing Jeffrey Lowe entering the building's parking garage at 7:15 a.m., 2 hours earlier than his usual arrival time. A soft knock on his door interrupted his observation. Brett looked up to see Olivia Fields, Jeffrey's executive assistant, standing in the doorway. Her normally flawless appearance showed subtle signs of distress. Her collar crooked, a pin trapped in her hastily twisted hair bun, and her fingers nervously fidgeting with her wedding ring. "Mr. Story, do you have a moment?" Her voice wavered slightly, despite her apparent attempt to maintain composure. Brett minimized the security footage window and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "What's on your mind, Olivia?" She stepped into the office, but remained standing, her knuckles gripping the back of the chair with a white-knuckled grip. "I need to tell you something, but I'm afraid I'll lose my job." Brett's expression remained carefully neutral, though his heart rate quickened. Years of security work had taught him the importance of creating a safe space for people to share difficult information. He stood slowly, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair. "Why don't we take a walk? The coffee shop across the street is usually quiet this time of day." Olivia visibly relaxed, nodding in agreement as she followed him to the elevator. They rode down in silence, the only sound the soft hum of the elevator machinery and the occasional ping of arriving floors. Pike Street Coffee was indeed quiet, with only a few customers tucked away in corners with laptops and headphones. Brett led Olivia to a secluded booth at the back of the coffee shop, positioning himself so that he could keep an eye on both the entrance and her face. "2 Americanos, please," he instructed the barista, pulling out his corporate card. And maybe a slice of lemon pound cake? He glanced at Olivia, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Once their coffee arrived, Brett waited patiently as Olivia wrapped her hands around the warm mug, seeming to draw strength from its comforting weight. "I've been Mr. Lowe's assistant for 8 months now," she began, her voice barely audible. At first, everything was normal. Regular meetings, standard calendar management, typical executive assistant duties. She paused to take a small sip of her coffee, collecting her thoughts. But about 3 months ago, things started to change. Brett observed her closely, his attention sharp, as she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she navigated to her messages. He started asking me to block out chunks of time on his calendar with vague labels, like external business development or strategic planning review. She continued, pushing the phone across the table. Brett glanced at the screen, scanning through a series of text messages. He would tell me to make excuses if anyone asked about his whereabouts during these times, especially his wife. Brett's trained eye noted the dates and times. And these meetings, they weren't meetings at all, Olivia's voice faltered. At least not business ones. He started asking me to book hotel rooms. Nice ones like the Four Seasons or the Thompson. But he wanted them reserved under project names, not his real name. She pulled up another set of messages, showing Brett the booking confirmations. I tried to tell myself it wasn't my business, that maybe they were legitimate confidential meetings. But then, she broke off, her breath shaky. "Take your time," Brett said softly, sliding the plate with the pound cake closer to her. "Last week, I was working late, organizing files for the quarterly review. Mr. Lowe had forgotten to log out of his email on the conference room computer." Olivia paused again, her fingers nervously twisting her wedding ring. "I saw an email thread between him and your wife," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. They were discussing meeting times, using code words they thought were clever, reviewing the Johnson brief, or following up on the Maxwell proposal. Brett kept his expression neutral, though his mind was racing, quickly cataloging this new information against the observations he had already made. "Why are you telling me this now, Olivia?" he asked. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she quickly dabbed at them with a napkin. "Because my own marriage ended last year due to infidelity. My ex-husband, he had an affair with a colleague. Everyone at his office knew, his assistant, his teammates, even the janitor. But nobody told me." She met Brett's eyes for the first time, her gaze direct. "For months, I was the only one who didn't know, living in this bubble of false security while people whispered behind my back. I swore I would never be part of doing that to someone else." Brett nodded slowly, processing everything she had shared. "These hotel bookings, do you have records of all of them?" Olivia reached in her bag and pulled out a small USB drive. "I copied everything I could, the bookings, the calendar entries, the email threads I saw. I know it might cost me my job, but..." She straightened her shoulders slightly. "Some things are more important than a paycheck." "Thank you, Olivia," Brett said quietly, his voice soft with appreciation. "I know this wasn't easy for you." She gave him a wan smile, then added, "There's one more thing you should know." "What's that?" "Yesterday, Mr. Lowe asked me to start researching properties in the Hawthorne Hills area, specifically looking for homes with privacy features, gated entrances, and mature landscaping. He said it was for a potential executive relocation package, but..." She trailed off, her eyes heavy with meaning. Brett didn't need her to finish the thought. He knew exactly what she was implying. Hawthorne Hills was one of Seattle's most exclusive neighborhoods, and it just so happened to be the same area where Sherry had mentioned wanting to move during their last dinner party. As they walked back to the office, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets shimmering in the weak afternoon sun. Before they reached the building's entrance, Brett turned to Olivia. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that you did the right thing, and your job is safe. I'll make sure of it." Olivia's relief was evident in the slight softening of her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Story. I hope you'll be okay." Brett watched her walk through the lobby and onto the elevator before pulling out his phone. He had some calls to make and security systems to review. The game was changing, and he needed to be ready for whatever came next. The following Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that marked a new chapter. Brett had arrived at the office well before sunrise, using the quiet hours to prepare for what he knew would be a pivotal day. The security upgrade project had been in the works for months, an official initiative to modernize the building's surveillance systems. What the board didn't know was that Brett had expedited certain aspects of the implementation, especially those involving the executive floor. "Morning, Mr. Story," called Marcus Chin, one of his senior security technicians, as he wheeled in a cart of equipment, ready to begin the executive suite installations. Brett nodded, reviewing the installation schedule on his tablet. "Let's start with the CFO's office. Mr. Lowe has an off-site meeting until noon." Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly. They both knew Jeffrey wasn't actually off-site, but neither of them made mention of it. Brett had chosen Marcus for this particular task because of his attention to detail and, more importantly, his discretion. "Standard package for this one?" Marcus asked, holding up one of the new security cameras, along with the additional audio monitoring module they had discussed. "Confirmed," Brett said, watching as Marcus's hands moved efficiently through the installation process. The small recording device, no bigger than a thumb drive, would be nearly invisible once it was placed behind Jeffrey's desk. They worked in silence, Brett occasionally checking his phone, where a specially designed app tracked Jeffrey's current location. The Thompson Hotel downtown. He'd been there for the past 2 hours. By 11:30, the installation was complete. Brett had already received the first test signals from the new equipment on his secure laptop. Marcus packed up his gear, leaving no trace of their work except for the official installation notice left on Jeffrey's desk. "Good luck, sir," Marcus said quietly as he left, and Brett knew he understood more than he let on. The first recording came through just after 2 p.m. Brett sat in his office, headphones on, listening to the mundane sounds of Jeffrey's business calls and the clicking of his keyboard. It wasn't until 4:37 p.m. that things took an interesting turn. The sound of high heels on hardwood floors was clear, followed by the soft click of a door closing. "We need to be more careful." Sherry's voice was unmistakable, carrying the same authoritative tone she used in court. Brett's fingers tightened on his desk as Jeffrey's voice came through next, sounding calm and confident. "Don't worry, I've got him focusing on a security upgrade project. Besides, he trusts you completely. Have you thought more about what we discussed?" There was a pause, and Brett could almost picture his wife's calculating expression, the same one she wore when planning her approach to a difficult case. "Yes, I think I know how to handle it. I'll suggest an open marriage. Make it seem like my idea." Jeffrey's voice lowered to a self-assured whisper, like it's something progressive and healthy. Sherry's soft laugh carried through the speaker before her voice took on a more strategic tone. "And if he agrees, then we don't have to hide anymore. And if he doesn't?" Jeffrey's voice was amused, but Sherry's was precise, the way she sounded in her closing arguments. "Well, I've already talked to Carmen Woodard about representing me in a divorce. She specializes in high-asset splits." The sound of movement filtered through the recording, the rustle of expensive fabric, the soft thud of someone settling onto a desk. Brett could envision the scene perfectly. Sherry perched on the edge of Jeffrey's mahogany desk, her tailored skirt riding up just enough to suggest something illicit, yet maintaining plausible deniability in case anyone walked in. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" Jeffrey's voice had dropped to a lower, more honeyed tone, one that made Brett's stomach twist uncomfortably. "That's what I love about you. Always 3 steps ahead. Someone has to be," Sherry replied, her voice dripping with confidence, a smile evident even in her tone. "You're too impulsive sometimes, Jeffrey. Like those flowers you sent to my office last week? I had them sent through the firm's usual vendor, under the client appreciation account." "Still risky," Jeffrey countered. "Jessica from accounting asked me about them." There was another shuffle of movement, followed by the unmistakable sound of lips meeting. Brett forced himself to stay focused, even as his free hand clenched into a fist. "What did you tell her?" Jeffrey asked, his voice now slightly breathless. "That they were from a grateful client, of course. But we need to be smarter." The click of Sherry's heels echoed as she moved around the office. "No more unscheduled visits to my office. No more lingering touches at company events. And absolutely no more hotel rooms booked through Olivia." Jeffrey's sharp intake of breath was clearly audible. "You don't trust her?" I don't trust anyone, darling, Sherry replied coldly. That's why I'm so good at what I do. The sound of a drawer opening and closing followed. Speaking of which, did you look at those investment documents I mentioned? Jeffrey's voice was tinged with anticipation. Yes, very interesting opportunity, Sherry responded smoothly. But the timing of the merger announcement will be perfect for... No, not here. She cut him off abruptly. Tonight, our usual place. I've already told Brett I have a late client meeting. Brett glanced at his watch. 4:52 p.m. He knew Sherry had indeed mentioned she'd be working late tonight, claiming a difficult negotiation with international clients that required her to stay at the office due to time zone differences. I should go, Jeffrey said, sounding eager. Sherry's voice came through again, dismissive but sharp. I have an actual client call in 5 minutes and need to review the briefs. Dinner at 8? Make it 8:30, Sherry added after a pause. I'll take care of the reservation. Under my usual alias. The sound of her heels fading away was followed by the soft click of a door closing. Through the recording, Brett could hear Jeffrey humming to himself as he returned to his desk. His posture relaxed, his demeanor that of a man who believed he had everything under control. Brett removed his headphones and leaned back in his chair, the implications of everything he had just heard beginning to settle in. The recording had provided far more than just confirmation of the affair. It had opened a window into potential securities violations, corporate espionage, and a carefully crafted plan to end his marriage on terms that would make him appear the unreasonable party. He opened his secure email and began composing a message to Marcus, requesting copies of all security footage involving Jeffrey and Sherry over the past 3 months. He then scrolled through his contact list and found the name he was looking for, Jocelyn Carney. Brett quickly typed out a meeting request to her. As he did, the usual end-of-day sounds from the office filtered through his door. The ding of elevators, the shuffle of feet, the hum of colleagues making dinner plans. It felt surreal, like background noise in a play where he was no longer the protagonist, but the only one who had realized it. His phone buzzed with a text from Sherry. Working late tonight? Don't wait up. Left lasagna in the fridge. Love you. A red heart followed. Brett typed his usual response. Thanks for letting me know. Stay safe. It was a message that fit perfectly into the pattern of their daily communications. Just another piece of evidence confirming what a dutiful, understanding husband he was, all while being in the dark about the life his wife was leading. The sun was setting over Elliott Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the glass buildings downtown. Back in Jeffrey's office, 14 floors above, the small recording device remained undisturbed, silently recording whatever secrets the next day might bring. Brett shut down his computer and gathered his things, keeping to his usual routine. To anyone watching, he was just another executive heading home after a productive day. But inside, he knew better. Tonight marked the beginning of a carefully planned counter-strategy, one that would require all his skills in security and surveillance to execute flawlessly. As he drove home in the growing darkness, Brett allowed himself a small smile. They thought they were being careful, believed they had accounted for every possible contingency. But they had made one critical error. They had underestimated what it truly meant to deceive someone who had spent their entire career perfecting the art of deception. The aroma of rosemary and garlic drifted through the house as Brett pulled into the driveway. His Tesla's headlights swept across the garage door, casting light over the meticulously maintained flower beds that lined the walkway. Something was different. The kitchen window blazed with light, and he could see Sherry's silhouette moving behind the curtains. Brett checked his watch. 6:45 p.m. She hadn't cooked dinner in months, always citing late meetings or urgent case preparations as reasons to skip it. He sat in the car for a moment longer, replaying the recording from Jeffrey's office one last time through his earbuds. Make it seem like my idea, Sherry's voice echoed in his ears. Taking a deep breath, he pocketed his phone and grabbed his briefcase. It was time to see just how well his wife had rehearsed her performance. The kitchen looked like something out of a magazine, an idealized version of domestic bliss. Sherry stood at the island, wearing the apron her mother had given her 3 Christmases ago, the one that usually hung untouched on the pantry door. Her dark hair was pulled back into a casual ponytail, and she had changed from her usual power suit into a soft cashmere sweater and yoga pants. "You're home," she said, looking up from where she was arranging fresh herbs on a platter of roasted chicken. "I thought we could have dinner together tonight. I made your favorite." She gestured to the formal dining room, where she had set the Wedgwood china and lit tapered candles. Brett loosened his tie, noting how she had already opened a bottle of their special occasion wine, a 2015 Chateau Margaux they'd bought during their anniversary trip to France. 2 crystal glasses sat on the counter, breathing. "This is unexpected," he said, moving to kiss her cheek. It was their usual greeting, though now it felt more like a performance, one maintained for appearance's sake. "What's the occasion?" Brett asked. Sherry's smile flickered, almost imperceptibly. "Does a wife need a reason to cook for her husband?" She gestured again toward the table. "I thought we could talk." Brett played along, helping her carry the dishes to the table. The scene was flawlessly staged. The warm lighting, the elegant table setting, the carefully casual atmosphere designed to put him at ease. He had seen Sherry prepare for enough courtroom appearances to recognize when she was setting up her audience. "This looks amazing," he said, settling into his chair. "The chicken smells just like that restaurant in Provence. I found the recipe online," Sherry replied, pouring the wine with practiced grace. "I've been thinking about that trip lately," she continued. "Remember how free we felt there? How everything seemed possible." Brett took a careful sip of wine, watching as she settled into her own chair, smoothing the napkin across her lap with deliberate movements. "Those were good times," he said. "They were," she agreed, twirling her wine glass in her hand, watching the burgundy liquid catch the candlelight. "It's made me think about us, about how relationships evolve over time." Brett braced himself, maintaining a neutral expression as Sherry launched into what he recognized as a speech. "You know, I've been doing a lot of reading lately about modern relationships and how they're changing." She paused, taking a delicate bite of chicken, watching him all the while. "There's this fascinating movement toward more open, honest approaches to marriage." She looked at him expectantly. Brett's fork hovered over his plate. "Open relationships, you mean?" "Yes, exactly." Her enthusiasm was palpable, and for a moment Brett almost admired her skill. She had always been an excellent performer. "It's not about betrayal or a lack of love," she continued. "It's about growth, about allowing partnerships to evolve naturally instead of forcing them into traditional boxes." She reached across the table, her hand resting over his. "I've been thinking that maybe we've reached a point in our marriage where we could explore something like that. We're both secure, successful people." She met his eyes, her gaze steady. "We don't need to cling to outdated models of monogamy." Brett set down his fork, studying her face in the soft glow of the candles. It hit him then she had practiced this moment. Every word, every gesture was precisely calculated. The carefully orchestrated dinner, the wine, the speech, it was all part of the act. But what did she think she was fooling? She had practiced looking vulnerable yet confident, progressive yet sensitive to his potential reactions. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Brett asked, though he already knew the answer from the recording. Sherry leaned back, launching into what appeared to be a well-rehearsed presentation. "Think about it," she said, her voice smooth. "We could maintain our strong foundation while allowing each other the freedom to explore connections with others. Many couples find that it actually strengthens their primary relationship. It's about honesty, communication, and mutual growth," she added, her words carefully measured. She was good, Brett had to admit. The way she framed it as a journey of mutual discovery, the emphasis on modern thinking and personal growth. Everything was designed to make any opposition seem regressive and insecure. "So, what do you think?" she asked, watching him closely for signs of distress. He could see her preparing herself for the arguments she had anticipated, ready to deploy the logic she had so carefully constructed. Brett took a slow sip of wine, letting the tension build. Then he shrugged casually. "Sure, go ahead and explore." The flash of confusion that crossed Sherry's face was priceless. Her carefully scripted scenario hadn't included this possibility. "That's it? You're not upset?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Why would I be?" he replied, spearing another piece of chicken. "The rosemary is perfect, by the way. Really brings me back to that little bistro in Nice." Sherry's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. But don't you want to discuss boundaries? Guidelines? She pressed, her voice suddenly more urgent. This is a major step in our relationship. Brett smiled mildly. I trust your judgment, Sherry. You've clearly given this a lot of thought. And you're right. We're both adults. We should be free to explore whatever connections feel natural. He watched her carefully, noting how she struggled to regain control of the conversation. This wasn't how her script was supposed to play out. There should have been resistance, an opportunity for her to deploy her well-rehearsed arguments about personal growth, modern love, and the liberation that open relationships promised. His easy acceptance had undermined her entire strategy. She stumbled, attempting once more. We should at least talk about how we'll handle things practically, she said, her voice tight. Other couples usually set up rules about disclosure, about when and where. Whatever you think is best, Brett interrupted smoothly. I respect your autonomy, and this chicken really is excellent. You should make it more often. The rest of dinner passed in a strange, almost surreal tension. Sherry made increasingly desperate attempts to draw him into a deeper discussion, while Brett maintained his pleasant, unbothered demeanor. He complimented the food, asked about her latest cases, and acted for all the world like she had simply suggested trying a new restaurant, rather than radically altering the foundation of their marriage. As they cleared the dishes, Sherry made one final attempt. You're taking this remarkably well, she said, studying his face. I expected more questions. Brett loaded the dishwasher, his expression still mild. You've always known what you wanted, Sherry, he said. It's one of the things I admire about you. He closed the dishwasher and pressed start, then turned to head upstairs. I'm going to catch up on some emails in my office. Thanks for dinner. It was really special. He could feel her eyes on him as he made his way upstairs. He knew she was trying to decrypt his reaction, trying to understand where a carefully laid plan had gone wrong. In his office, Brett pulled up the security feed from Jeffrey's office on his laptop. Sherry's name popped up on the CFO's caller ID less than 10 minutes after dinner. Brett smiled to himself, saving another recording to his growing collection of evidence. Sometimes, the best move in chess wasn't to counter your opponent's strategy. It was to simply step aside and let them stumble on their own momentum. The week that followed Brett's unexpected acceptance of the open marriage proposal unfolded like a slow-motion train wreck. Sherry grew increasingly agitated, her carefully constructed plans spiraling out of her control. Brett observed it all through the lens of his security cameras and recording devices, watching as the pressure began to crack their perfectly maintained facades. Monday morning began with Sherry pacing on the back porch, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Brett, preparing his coffee, watched through the kitchen window, noting how she kept glancing back toward the house. He just agreed. No questions, no arguments, nothing. Sherry's voice was laced with frustration. I don't like it, Jeffrey. He's too calm about this, she added, her free hand gesturing wildly. Brett smiled to himself as he stirred cream into his coffee. The security system he had upgraded months ago picked up her conversation, clearly through the outdoor sensors. Maybe he's just more progressive than we thought. Jeffrey's voice crackled through Brett's hidden earpiece. Isn't this what we wanted? No, nobody is this understanding, Sherry hissed. You don't know Brett like I do. He analyzes everything. He's planning something. I can feel it. At work, the dynamic shifted subtly. Jeffrey's usual confident swagger through the office had taken on an edge of nervous energy. Brett watched through the security feeds as the CFO compulsively checked his phone, jumped slightly whenever his office door opened, and began taking longer and longer lunches with Sherry. By Wednesday, the cracks were starting to show. Brett sat in his office, monitoring the feed from the small camera he had installed in the executive parking garage. There, Jeffrey and Sherry stood between their cars, their body language tense. You're being paranoid, Jeffrey said, reaching for her arm. This is exactly what we planned for. Sherry yanked her arm away, her voice sharp. Am I? Yesterday, he asked how my exploring was going, with this little smirk, like he knows something. And this morning, he mentioned that he ran into Carmen Woodard at the courthouse. So what? He can't prove anything, Jeffrey responded, stepping closer and lowering his voice. Besides, we've been careful, haven't we? Brett switched to another feed, This one from Jeffrey's office, where he had left his laptop open. A new message had popped up from his broker regarding your inquiry about the maxi-tech positions. The pieces were falling into place. Brett opened his own email, composing a message to Jocelyn Carney, the ambitious partner at Wakefield and Ross who had been trying to recruit Sherry for years. He attached several carefully selected audio files and calendar entries. Would love to discuss a sensitive matter over coffee, he wrote, concerning mutual interests and potential opportunities. The response came within minutes. For Season's private dining room, 1 p.m. Meanwhile, Sherry's attempts to provoke a reaction from Brett continued to escalate. She began casually mentioning late meetings, dropping names of male colleagues in a conversation, and leaving her phone conspicuously visible, with text notifications from Jeffrey popping up on the screen. Thursday evening, she cornered him in the kitchen. "I'm having dinner with a colleague tonight," she announced, her eyes studying his face. "From the firm's corporate division. You don't mind, do you?" "Of course not," Brett replied, not looking up from his tablet as he reviewed security footage. "Have fun. Don't forget we have that dinner party tomorrow night." Her hands slammed down on the counter, her voice rising. "That's it? No questions about who I'm meeting? Where we're going?" Brett finally looked up, his expression mild. "You're an adult, Sherry. I trust your judgment. Remember?" He could see the frustration building behind her eyes. This wasn't how she had imagined their open marriage experiment playing out. She had expected jealousy, demands for information, something she could push against to justify her actions. His complete acceptance left her with no purchase, no way to paint him as the controlling husband she had planned to portray. At work, Jeffrey's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Convinced that Brett's approval of the open marriage meant he was either oblivious or simply didn't care, he began taking more risks. The security cameras caught longer, more intimate meetings in his office with Sherry. Their emails became less guarded, and their lunch dates grew more frequent and public. What neither of them knew was that Brett had already met with Jocelyn Carney. In the private dining room of the Four Seasons, he laid out his evidence: the recordings, the email trails, and the security footage. But more importantly, he presented something else: proof of potential insider trading and violations of attorney-client privilege. "If what you're showing me is true," Jocelyn had said, reviewing the recordings, "this could destroy both their careers." Attorney-client privilege exists for a reason. Brett nodded, sliding another document across the table. "If Sherry's been discussing cases with Jeffrey," he began, "and if Jeffrey's been making investment decisions based on information from those discussions." Jocelyn's eyes widened as she reviewed the trading records Brett had obtained. "How long have you been gathering this?" "Long enough," Brett replied. "The question is, what's it worth to Wakefield and Ross to have this handled discreetly?" The pieces were all in place now. Brett had transformed what Sherry and Jeffrey thought was a simple affair into a complex web of professional misconduct and potential criminal behavior. Their attempts to manipulate him through the open marriage proposal had given him the perfect cover to spring his trap. Friday evening arrived, bringing with it the dinner party that would bring all the players together. Brett observed as Sherry fussed over the table settings, arranging the name cards with meticulous care. Jeffrey and Dana's cards sat directly across from Brett and Sherry's places, a subtle power move that would soon backfire in spectacular fashion. The stage was set. All that remained was for the actors to perform their final scenes, unaware that the script had been entirely rewritten behind their backs. The dinner party had been Sherry's idea, a carefully orchestrated display of normalcy meant to cement the new status quo. The guest list included 3 other couples from their social circle, with Jeffrey and Dana Sanders as the featured players in their ongoing drama. Brett watched from the kitchen as Sherry placed the last of the appetizers on their hand-painted Italian platters. She had chosen her outfit with care, a deep blue dress that managed to be both elegant and subtly alluring. Every detail had been accounted for, from the strategic seating arrangement to the selection of wines. The doorbell chimed at exactly 7 o'clock. Dana Sanders entered first, her smile brittle as she handed over a bottle of champagne. Jeffrey followed, his usual confident swagger, somewhat diminished under Brett's unflinching gaze. "Brett, good to see you," Jeffrey said, extending his hand. His palm was slightly damp. "Beautiful evening for a dinner party." "Indeed it is," Brett replied, noting how Jeffrey's eyes darted to Sherry, who was greeting Dana with their kisses and compliments on her dress. The other guests arrived in quick succession. The Hendersons from Brett's golf club, the Patels from Sherry's yoga studio, and the Michelsons from their neighborhood association. Soon, the living room hummed with conversation and the clink of glasses. "Dinner is served," Sherry announced after the appropriate amount of cocktail chatter. She had prepared her signature cocoa vin, the same dish she'd made the first time they'd hosted Jeffrey and Dana. Brett recalled with a slight smirk. The symmetry was almost poetic. The tension around the dining table was palpable, though only 4 of the 10 people present truly understood why. Dana's forced smile grew more strained with each passing moment as she watched Jeffrey pass the salt to Sherry. Their fingers brushed in a touch that lingered a fraction too long. The other guests remained oblivious, caught up in discussions about private school admissions and the latest restaurant openings. "So, Brett," Jeffrey said, his voice carrying a false bravado that he had adopted since their new arrangement began. "How's the security upgrade project coming along?" Brett dabbed his lips with his napkin, enjoying the flicker of unease that crossed both Jeffrey and Sherry's faces. "Quite well. Actually, we've implemented some fascinating new monitoring systems. The level of detail we can capture now is remarkable." Sherry's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. "Darling, I'm sure no one wants to hear about technical security details over dinner." "Oh, I don't know," Brett smiled, observing how Jeffrey's collar suddenly seemed too tight. "I think some people might find it very interesting. For instance, did you know modern systems can track not just video and audio, but also electronic communications, access card usage patterns, even booking records?" Dana's fork clattered against her plate. "How fascinating," she said, her voice hollow. Jeffrey never mentions anything about the technical side of the business at home. The emphasis on "at home" was subtle but clear. The evening began its downward spiral, a symphony of subtle jabs and loaded glances. Brett watched it all with the detached interest of a scientist observing an increasingly intriguing experiment. He noticed how Sherry's hand shook slightly as she served dessert, how Jeffrey kept checking his phone under the table, and how Dana's smile grew more brittle with every passing moment. "The creme brulee is divine, Sherry," Mrs. Henderson gushed, oblivious to the undercurrents. "You simply must share the recipe." "Family secret," Sherry replied, her practiced social smile firmly in place. "Passed down from my grandmother. Actually, it's from that cooking class we took in Paris," Brett corrected mildly. "The one right after that legal conference where you met Jeffrey for the first time, wasn't it?" The clink of spoons against china faltered for a moment. Sherry's smile froze, and Jeffrey's hand tightened visibly around his water glass. "Speaking of Paris," Dana said, her voice carrying a sharp edge, "Jeffrey, didn't you say you had a business trip there next month? Funny, your assistant mentioned it was canceled when I called the office today." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Brett caught the quick glance between Sherry and Jeffrey, saw the panic flicker in their eyes. As the evening wound down, the other guests began making their excuses, perhaps sensing the growing strain in the atmosphere. Soon, only Jeffrey and Dana remained. The 4 of them stood awkwardly in the foyer. "We should do this again soon," Jeffrey said, his forced cheerfulness fooling no one. "Oh, I think once was enough," Dana replied coldly, already turning toward the door. After they left, Sherry rounded on Brett in their bedroom, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "You're bluffing about something. I can tell. What do you know?" Brett calmly walked to his home office, aware of Sherry's heels clicking angrily behind him. He retrieved his laptop, opened it, and pulled up the folder he'd prepared for this very moment. "Why don't you have a seat?" he suggested, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Don't patronize me," Sherry snapped, but she sat anyway, her lawyer's instincts kicking in. "Whatever you think you know," Brett pressed play, and her own voice filled the room. "We need to be more careful. Brett's been asking questions about my late nights at the office." The color drained from Sherry's face as the conversation continued, revealing not just the affair, but their plans to use insider information for personal gain. Her hands gripped the arms of the chair, knuckles turning white. "How did you?" "You had no right," she sputtered, her lawyer's poise deserting her completely. Actually, as head of corporate security, investigating potential insider trading falls exactly under my jurisdiction. Brett closed the laptop with a decisive click. Now, let's discuss how healthy a divorce will be for your career. Sherry stood up, so quickly her chair tipped backward. You've been spying on me? On my private conversations? I'll have your license for this. Oh. Brett's voice remained calm. Go to the Bar Association? Explain how you violated attorney-client privilege by sharing confidential information with Jeffrey? Or maybe you'd like to discuss those investment moves he made right before the Maxitech merger announcement. That's not. We never. Sherry's legal training kicked in, and she stopped herself mid-sentence. I want a lawyer present for this conversation. Carmen Woodard, perhaps? Brett suggested, his tone calm, although I doubt she'll be interested in taking your case once she sees the full scope of evidence. Insider trading tends to make even the most aggressive divorce attorneys nervous. The fight seemed to drain out of Sherry all at once. She sank back into the righted chair, her face ashen. What do you want? Want? Brett leaned back in his chair. I want you to understand exactly how badly you miscalculated. You thought I was the trusting fool who would either accept your open marriage proposal or react badly enough to justify your planned divorce strategy. Instead, you handed me everything I needed to protect myself while exposing your own unethical behavior. Sherry's eyes narrowed, her legal mind visibly working through the implications. You've been planning this for months, haven't you? The security upgrade, the recordings. You knew all along. I'm head of corporate security, Sherry. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't investigate? You and Jeffrey got sloppy. The lunch meetings, the hotel bookings through his assistant, the conveniently timed trades. You left a trail a first-year security analyst could have followed. Brett stood up, his movement deliberate and controlled. I suggest you spend the night thinking very carefully about your next move. Your career, your reputation, your future. They all depend on what you do next. He left her sitting in his office, staring at the closed laptop that contained evidence of her downfall. As he walked down the hallway, he could hear her phone buzzing, probably from Jeffrey, wanting to discuss the disaster of a dinner party. But Brett knew Sherry wouldn't answer. She was too smart not to realize that every word she said from now on could be used against her. The game was over, and Brett had played his hand perfectly. Now it was just a matter of watching the pieces fall where they may. The morning after the confrontation dawned gray and cold. Brett had spent the night in his home office, monitoring the cascade of events he'd set in motion with a series of precisely timed emails. At 6 a.m., the first response arrived from Thomas Wheeler, chairman of the board at Meridian Technologies. Emergency board meeting called for 8 a.m. security team standing by. By 6:30 a.m., Clayton Ross himself had responded to Brett's evidence package. The founding partner's terse reply spoke volumes. Internal review initiated. Sherry Duncan suspended, pending investigation. Meeting with ethics committee at 9 a.m. Sherry emerged from their bedroom at 7:15 a.m., dressed in one of her power suits, charcoal gray Armani, her armor for difficult days in court. She stopped short when she saw Brett in the kitchen, calmly sipping his coffee while reviewing emails on his tablet. I've called Carmen, she said, her voice hoarse from what had clearly been a sleepless night. She's meeting me at 8. Brett nodded, not looking up. I'm sure she'll find the complete evidence package very enlightening. It should be in her inbox by now. Sherry's hand trembled as she reached for her car keys. You're bluffing. You wouldn't risk your own career by admitting to corporate surveillance. Everything was done through proper channels. As part of an official investigation into potential securities violations, Brett finally met her gaze. The SEC tends to look favorably on internal whistleblowers who follow protocol. The sound of car tires on their driveway interrupted whatever response Sherry had planned. Through the kitchen window, they could see Jeffrey's Tesla pulling up, his face visible through the windshield, tight with panic. Don't, Brett said as Sherry moved toward the door. Unless you want to add conspiracy charges to the ethics violations. Jeffrey's insistent knocking echoed through the house. Sherry stood frozen between the kitchen and the foyer, her legal mind visibly wrestling with her instincts. Mr. Lowe, Brett called out, his voice carrying easily through the door. I suggest you contact your personal attorney immediately. The board meeting starts in 45 minutes. The knocking stopped. Through the security feed on his tablet, Brett watched as Jeffrey practically ran back to his car, phone already pressed to his ear. Sherry's own phone buzzed. A text from Carmen Woodard. Brett could see the message preview on the screen. Meeting canceled. Cannot represent you in this matter. Conflict of interest. It's already happening, isn't it? Sherry's voice had lost its usual sharp edge. You've sent everything to everyone. Not everything, Brett replied, standing to rinse his coffee cup, just enough to ensure the right questions were asked by the right people. The next few hours unfolded exactly as Brett had anticipated. Jeffrey was met at Meridian's offices by security personnel, who escorted him directly to the boardroom. His access credentials had already been deactivated. Sherry's arrival at Caldwell and Ross was equally dramatic. Her key card was denied at the parking garage, forcing her to wait in the lobby while senior partners gathered for an emergency session. By noon, the initial shockwaves had rippled through Seattle's corporate legal community. Brett monitored it all from his office at Meridian, where he had been asked to present his findings to the board. The evidence was damning. Recorded conversations about confidential cases, emails discussing privileged information, trading records that coincided suspiciously with major decisions. This goes beyond a simple affair, Thomas Wheeler announced to the assembled board members, his face grave as he reviewed the documentation. We're looking at potential criminal liability here. In the corner of the room, Olivia Fields sat taking notes, her position secure thanks to Brett's careful preparation. She had been officially recognized as a cooperating witness. Her earlier warnings about Jeffrey's behavior now documented as part of the initial investigation. Meanwhile, at Caldwell and Ross, Sherry's attempts to get ahead of the story backfired spectacularly. She tried to file for divorce first thing that morning, claiming emotional abuse and invasion of privacy. But Carmen Woodard had withdrawn from the case as soon as she reviewed the full scope of evidence Brett had compiled. I can't represent you in this matter, Carmen's email had stated bluntly. The potential criminal implications exceed the scope of a simple divorce proceeding. I recommend you seek counsel specializing in securities law. Dana Sanders hadn't wasted any time either. By 2 o'clock, Brett received word that she'd retained Carrie Bridges, a divorce attorney notorious for her handling of high-profile infidelity cases. Bridges' reputation for aggressive discovery processes and media management had earned her the nickname the Piranha among Seattle's legal elite. Mrs. Sanders is prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation, Bridges' official statement read. She was unaware of any improper business relationships or potential securities violations. The scandal threatened to expose not just the affair, but potentially years of ethical violations that could impact dozens of cases and deals. As the day wore on, both Meridian Technologies and Caldwell and Ross found themselves fielding increasingly frantic calls from clients concerned about possible breaches of confidentiality. By late afternoon, Sherry's pristine reputation lay in ruins. Her office had been sealed, her files flagged for review, and her clients were already being reassigned to other partners. The managing partners at Caldwell and Ross moved swiftly to contain the damage, their concern less for Sherry's career than for the firm's reputation. Jeffrey fared no better. The board placed him on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. His company phone was confiscated, his email access terminated, and security escorts were posted to monitor the removal of his personal belongings from the office. Brett watched it all unfold from his command center in the security office. Each development occurred exactly as he predicted. The careful groundwork he'd laid over months, the properly documented investigations, the officially sanctioned surveillance, the meticulously preserved evidence chain, ensured that every action taken was legally unassailable. As the sun set over Elliott Bay, Brett received one final email. It was from Jocelyn Carney at the competing firm of Wakefield and Ross. Interesting developments today. Perhaps we should discuss how to contain this situation for all parties' benefit. Breakfast tomorrow? Brett smiled as he typed his response. The pieces were falling exactly where he'd placed them, and the real negotiations were about to begin. The private dining room at the Columbia Tower Club offered a sweeping view of the morning fog, the Space Needle rising through the mist like a ship's mast piercing the clouds. Brett arrived 15 minutes early, fully aware of Jocelyn Carney's reputation for punctuality. She didn't disappoint, making her entrance at precisely 7:30 a.m., impeccably dressed in a navy suit that likely cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her handshake was firm, and her smile was carefully calibrated to project the right mix of professional interest and personal understanding. "Quite a show yesterday," she remarked, settling into her chair as the waiter poured their coffee. "Though I suspect we only saw Act 1, Brett replied, adjusting his napkin and maintaining the calm demeanor that had served him well throughout this entire ordeal. "That depends entirely on how the remaining players choose to proceed," he added, a steady tone masking the underlying resolve. Jocelyn opened her leather portfolio, extracting a series of documents. "We've reviewed everything you sent over. The recordings, the trading records, the email trails. Impressive work, by the way. Very thorough. I'm nothing if not detail-oriented," Brett said, taking note of her admiring glance. The waiter arrived with their breakfast, steel-cut oatmeal with fresh berries for Jocelyn, eggs Benedict for Brett. They waited until he withdrew before continuing. "Here's what we're proposing," Jocelyn said, sliding a document across the table. "Sherry joins our firm, but in a reduced capacity with strict oversight. She makes a clean break from both you and Jeffrey, signs an NDA about the circumstances, and we handle any potential ethical reviews internally." Brett took a careful bite of his eggs, letting the silence stretch between them. "And Jeffrey?" he asked, his voice steady. "The board is offering him early retirement with a significantly reduced package, conditional on his immediate resignation and full cooperation with their internal investigation," Jocelyn said, stirring her oatmeal with measured precision. "Everyone saves face. No one goes to jail, and the scandal stays contained." "Interesting proposal," Brett commented, dabbing his lips with his napkin. "And what makes you think I'm interested in containment?" Jocelyn's smile sharpened. "Because you're smart. You've positioned this perfectly. Not as a vengeful husband, but as a corporate security director who uncovered serious ethical violations. That distinction protects your professional reputation and keeps you above the emotional fray." She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. "But if this goes public, if it turns into a media circus," she let the implication linger. "Go on," Brett encouraged. "Wakefield and Ross can absorb Sherry's client list without disruption. We have the infrastructure to monitor her activities and ensure compliance with all ethical guidelines," Jocelyn continued, eyes locking with his. "More importantly, we have the political connections to smooth over any regulatory concerns." Brett took a sip of his coffee, considering her words. "And Dana Sanders?" "Mrs. Sanders will receive a very generous divorce settlement, including property in the Hamptons she's had her eye on," Jocelyn replied. "Jeffrey's reduced retirement package will be structured to prioritize their separation agreement." The negotiation continued through 2 more coffee refills, each point carefully discussed and documented. Brett had to admire Jocelyn's thoroughness. She'd thought through every angle, every potential complication. "One more thing," Brett said as they reviewed the final terms. "Olivia Fields remains at Meridian, with a promotion and a clear record." Jocelyn nodded, making a note. "Already handled. The board sees her as a whistleblower who followed proper channels. She'll be fine." The deal wasn't about revenge. It was about containment. It was about finding the cleanest way to excise a tumor while preserving the health of the surrounding tissue. Brett had positioned himself perfectly, transforming a personal betrayal into a professional triumph. "I'll have the papers drawn up by this afternoon," Jocelyn said, gathering her materials. "Assuming all parties agree, we can have this wrapped up by the end of the week." Brett stood, adjusting his suit jacket. "One final point. I'll need a forensic accountant to review all the relevant transactions. Someone discreet, but thorough." Jocelyn gave a slight nod. "Of course. I'll arrange that." Brett extended his hand. "Good work." As she shook it, Brett felt a surge of satisfaction. The pieces were falling exactly where he wanted them to, and the endgame was drawing near. "I know just the person," Jocelyn replied. "Robin Andrews. She's worked with us before on sensitive cases. I'll have her contact you." As they shook hands, Jocelyn paused. "You know, if you ever decide to leave Meridian, we could use someone with your attention to detail. One career change at a time." Brett smiled. "Let's get this situation resolved first." The rest of the day blurred into a haze of conference calls and document reviews. By sunset, all parties had received their copies of the agreement. Brett watched through the security feeds as Jeffrey cleared out his office under supervision. Sherry was escorted from Caldwell and Ross for the last time, and Dana Sanders' team began cataloging their joint assets. The deal wasn't perfect, but it was clean. Everyone would survive, though with wounds that would take time to heal. Brett's reputation would emerge not only intact but enhanced. The dedicated security professional who had uncovered and properly reported serious ethical violations. As he reviewed the final paperwork, Brett allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The game had played out exactly as he'd planned, every piece moving precisely as intended. Now, it was time to close this chapter and think about what came next. 6 months later, the rhythm of autumn had settled in. The morning fog gave way to crisp, clear days, showcasing the city at its best. Brett sat in a window booth at Cafe Seneca, watching sunlight dance across Elliott Bay while waiting for his breakfast companion. Robin Andrews arrived precisely on time, her auburn hair catching the morning light as she navigated between tables. The forensic accountant had become a regular part of Brett's life over the past few months, their professional collaboration slowly evolving into something more personal. "Sorry if I'm late," she said, settling into the booth. "The Morrison audit ran long this morning." "You're right on time," Brett replied, pushing a cup of coffee, prepared exactly as she liked it, across the table. "How's the new case going?" "Fascinating," Robin said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Actually, she continued, most people would have just gotten angry, maybe caused a scene. But you played it smart. You protected not just yourself, but potentially dozens of clients and shareholders who could have been affected by their actions." Brett smiled, thinking back over the past 6 months. The aftermath of the scandal had unfolded exactly as planned. Sherry had transitioned to Wakefield and Ross, her role significantly reduced, but her career salvaged. Jeffrey had accepted early retirement, moving to a small town in Arizona, where he now listed himself as a business consultant on LinkedIn. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting people face the consequences of their own choices, Brett observed, just as his phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline caught his eye. Caldwell and Ross announces merger with East Coast firm. Scanning the article quickly, he noted that Sherry's name was conspicuously absent from the announcement of the combined leadership team. Brett turned off his phone, focusing instead on the woman across from him. "We should probably head out if we want to make our dinner reservations," he said. Robin gathered her things, her movements precise and methodical, one of the many things Brett had come to appreciate about her. As they walked toward the door, Brett found himself instinctively reaching to hold it open for her, a gesture that felt natural rather than practiced. He'd lost a marriage, yes, but he had gained something far more valuable: self-respect, professional advancement, and a chance at genuine happiness. As they walked toward the restaurant, Brett found himself appreciating the honest simplicity of their connection. No games, no hidden agendas. Just two people who had found each other through a shared appreciation for integrity and truth. "Penny for your thoughts?" Robin asked as they waited at a crosswalk. "Just thinking about endings and beginnings," Brett replied. "How sometimes they're the same thing." The light changed, and they crossed the street together, their pace naturally in sync. Ahead, the city stretched out with all its possibilities. Brett realized that sometimes the end of one story was simply the beginning of a better one. Behind them, the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, a perfect sunset marking the close of one chapter and the opening of another. Brett had emerged from the chaos not only intact, but stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. As they walked past the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, Brett felt a deep sense of contentment. He had navigated the storm with a calm and skilled hand, ensuring not just his own safety, but the well-being of everyone who might have otherwise been swept up in a messier resolution. Ahead, the warm glow of the restaurant promised good food, better company, and the quiet joy of an evening shared with someone who understood the importance of honesty. Brett held the door open, and as Robin passed by, her smile radiating, he understood that this moment, simple genuine, was far more valuable than all the perfectly staged photographs and carefully curated appearances of his past life. The maitre d' led them to their table, and as they settled into the evening, Brett found himself reflecting on the fact that sometimes the best stories don't end in dramatic confrontations or bitter victories. Sometimes they end with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you've handled things well, protected what was worth protecting, and discovered something real along the way. 5 years later, in the corner office of Wakefield and Ross, Brett now served as the global head of corporate security and compliance. The irony of working in the same firm that had once offered Sherry sanctuary wasn't lost on him. But the past 5 years had reshaped both the company and his own life in ways he could never have predicted. Robin, now his partner both in business and in life, sat across from him, reviewing their latest joint project. Their marriage, built on the foundation of mutual respect and unwavering honesty from that first collaboration during the investigation, had grown stronger with time. Her forensic accounting firm had become the go-to consultancy for sensitive corporate investigations, often working alongside Brett's security expertise to deliver comprehensive solutions. "Did you see this morning's Bar Association announcement?" Robin asked, sliding her tablet across the table. Brett scanned the headline. Former Caldwell and Ross partner Sherry Duncan's reinstatement petition denied for the third time. The article detailed how Sherry's attempts to rebuild her legal career continued to stall, despite her completion of ethics courses and her supervised practice requirements at Wakefield and Ross's Nevada office. She never quite recovered from the ethics violations, Robin observed, taking back her tablet. Brett nodded. The insider trading charges were too much, he said, recalling how the scandal had unraveled. Sherry's role at Wakefield and Ross had grown more and more marginal as clients became aware of her past misdeeds. Eventually, the firm had reassigned her to their Las Vegas office, where she managed routine corporate filings under tight supervision. The once promising legal career had been reduced to handling paperwork and overseeing junior associates, with her name forever tarnished in Seattle's legal circles. "I heard from Olivia Fields yesterday," Brett remarked. "She's being promoted to chief of staff at Meridian." Thomas Wheeler specifically mentioned her integrity during the Jeffrey Lowe investigation as a key factor in the decision. Olivia's career had thrived in the aftermath of the scandal. Her role in exposing the ethical violations had earned her a reputation for principled leadership, and she had risen steadily through the ranks at Meridian. She had even written a well-received article for the Harvard Business Review on corporate whistleblowing and ethical responsibility. Speaking of Jeffrey, Robin interjected, pulling up another news item. His consulting business in Arizona didn't last long. The article detailed Jeffrey Lowe's latest failure, his third failed business venture since leaving Seattle. After his retirement package was depleted by Dana's divorce settlement and legal fees, he had tried to establish himself as a financial advisor. However, his involvement in the Meridian scandal had made him toxic to potential clients. Now, he worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a local chain of hardware stores, his dreams of corporate success reduced to reconciling retail receipts. Dana Sanders, on the other hand, had flourished. After divorcing Jeffrey, she used her settlement to open an art gallery in New York's Chelsea district. Her sharp eye for emerging artists and her business acumen had transformed it into a respected establishment. She had recently married a prominent museum curator, and their social media accounts radiated a happiness that had been absent during her marriage to Jeffrey. "Remember Carmen Woodard?" Brett asked, reaching for his coffee. The attorney who had refused to take Sherry's divorce case? She had just been named managing partner in her firm. It turned out that her decision to withdraw from their case had become a case study in ethical decision-making at Seattle University's law school. The ripple effects of the scandal had reshaped Seattle's corporate landscape in ways no one could have anticipated. The merger of Caldwell and Ross had been just the beginning. The exposure of insider trading vulnerabilities had led to sweeping reforms in how law firms and corporations manage sensitive information. Brett's methodical approach to uncovering the ethical violations had become a blueprint for internal investigations, earning him a steady stream of speaking engagements at security conferences. "Jocelyn Carney called this morning," Robin said, glancing at her calendar. "The firm's expanding its compliance division again. She wants your input on the new security protocols." Brett smiled at the mention of Jocelyn. Her adept handling of the scandal's aftermath had propelled her career to new heights. Now heading Wakefield and Ross's West Coast operations, she had become the firm's go-to expert for crisis management. I ran into Carrie Bridges at the courthouse yesterday, Robin continued. She mentioned that Dana's Gallery is opening a Seattle branch next spring. Apparently, Jeffrey tried to claim a share of the profits, arguing that the initial investment came from their marriage assets. How did that go? About as well as you'd expect. The judge dismissed his claim in less than 10 minutes. With the documented insider trading and evidence of his infidelity, he has zero credibility in any courtroom. Before Brett could respond, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Jake Chun, Marcus's son, who had followed in his father's footsteps, stood in the doorway with a security report. Marcus had retired the previous year, but his legacy lived on in the security protocols he and Brett had developed. The quarterly compliance review is ready, sir, Jake said, handing over a thick folder. We've implemented all the new monitoring systems you recommended. Brett thanked him, his mind briefly drifting to Marcus's meticulous training of Jake, how it mirrored the same attention to detail that had helped uncover Sherry and Jeffrey's transgressions. The security team's reputation for thoroughness had only grown stronger over the years. As Jake left, Robin pulled up another email on her tablet. The SEC just released their annual enforcement report. They've cited our joint investigation protocols as a model for corporate compliance. 3 other firms have already reached out about consulting contracts. Brett smiled. Their professional partnership had been just as successful as their personal one. His security expertise combined with Robin's financial forensics had created a robust methodology for detecting and preventing corporate misconduct. They had even co-authored a paper for the Journal of Corporate Security on integrating surveillance and financial monitoring. Almost forgot, Robin said, gathering her materials. We're still on for dinner with Thomas Wheeler tonight, right? He wants to discuss expanding our advisory role at Meridian. Brett nodded, checking his own calendar. Meridian Technologies had emerged stronger from the scandal. Their swift handling of the ethical violations had earned them respect within the business community. Thomas Wheeler had turned the experience into an opportunity to revamp corporate governance, with Brett and Robin's firm providing ongoing consultation. As they prepared to leave for their dinner meeting, Brett's phone buzzed with a news alert. A small legal notice caught his eye. Sherry had finally sold their old house in Laurelhurst at a significant loss. The real estate listing had carefully omitted any mention of its connection to the corporate scandal that had rocked Seattle's business world. Ready? Robin asked, holding the office door open with a smile. Brett turned off his phone and joined his wife. Their steps fell into sync as they walked toward the elevator. The skyline stretched out before them, the same view that had witnessed so many crucial moments in their story. But now it held different meanings. The buildings were no longer just architectural features. They had become monuments to integrity, to consequences, to the power of truth to reshape lives. As they descended to the parking garage, Brett reflected on how thoroughly the scandal had transformed Seattle's corporate landscape. Sherry and Jeffrey's affair had exposed vulnerabilities in the way businesses handled sensitive information, leading to stricter controls and more rigorous oversight. Their attempts to manipulate the system for personal gain had, ironically, resulted in reforms that made such manipulation much more difficult for others. The evening traffic crawled through downtown, providing Brett with the opportunity to reflect on how vastly different his life had become. His marriage to Robin was everything his relationship with Sherry had not been, rooted in mutual respect, professional admiration, and complete honesty. Together, they had even begun leading seminars on corporate ethics and compliance, their own story now serving as a compelling testament to the fact that integrity, in the end, always prevails. As they pulled into the restaurant parking lot, Brett noticed Thomas Wheeler's car already there. The Meridian chairman, who had become far more than just a colleague over the years, was now a close friend and a strong advocate for the compliance systems that Brett and Robin had helped implement. You know, Robin remarked as they walked toward the entrance, sometimes I think Sherry and Jeffrey did us all a favor. Their mistakes led to better security, stronger ethical guidelines, and ultimately brought us together. Brett smiled, holding the door open for his wife. Sometimes the worst choices lead to the best outcomes, he said, for everyone except the ones making those choices. Inside, Thomas waved them over to a corner table, his face eager, as always, to discuss the latest developments in corporate security. As Brett settled into his chair, he realized that what had initially felt like the end, the scandal that had turned their lives upside down, had actually marked the beginning of something far more significant. Not just for him, but for an entire business community that had learned invaluable lessons about trust, integrity, and the true cost of betrayal. The night stretched out beyond the restaurant windows, the city lights twinkling like stars in the distance. Somewhere in Las Vegas, Sherry was probably going over routine corporate filings. In Arizona, Jeffrey was likely reconciling the day's receipts for a hardware store. And here in Seattle, the city they had once sought to deceive, their legacy endured. But not in the way they had hoped. Instead, it stood as a powerful reminder that character, in the end, determines destiny.